What kind of world ignores a child's voice until it's too late to hear the truth she's carrying in her shaking hands? Ethan Kong had heard every kind of noise Manhattan could produce: the impatient honk of late-night traffic, the low hum of wealth moving behind tinted windows, the polite laughter of people who had never once worried about rent. But nothing in his world sounded like the small trembling voice that broke through the rain that night. Please, they're hurting. My mama. He stopped, not because he wanted to, but because the words caught somewhere deeper than logic. His polished leather shoes stilled against the slick pavement as a tiny hand clutched the sleeve of his charcoal overcoat, the fabric worth more than most people's monthly paycheck. And for a brief second the entire city seemed to pause around them. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her sneakers soaked, her braids damp against her cheeks, her breathing uneven like she had run farther than her body was meant to go. Ethan looked down slowly, his expression unreadable, not cruel, not kind, just distant, calculating, the way a man looks at something that doesn't belong in his carefully controlled world. In his experience, children on the street at night usually meant trouble, a setup, a distraction, something designed to pull attention away from something far worse. And Ethan Kong did not survive in his world by reacting emotionally. He survived by assuming the worst first and being proven wrong later if necessary. But the girl didn't let go. Her fingers tightened instead, as if she understood that letting go meant losing something she couldn't afford to lose. Please, she said again, her voice cracking this time. They said we don't belong here. The words didn't match her age. They carried something heavier, something learned, not imagined. And that was what made Ethan's eyes narrow slightly. Not sympathy, not yet, just recognition that this was not a random moment. He followed her gaze across the street to the glow of warm golden light spilling from floor-to-ceiling windows, a restaurant he knew well, not as a customer but as its owner, a flagship location of Kong Dining Group, where reservations booked out 3 months in advance and a single dinner could cost $300 per person, a place designed for perfection, for exclusivity, for control, everything the street outside was not. And yet here stood a child from a world that never touched his, standing at the edge of his empire, asking for something he had long ago trained himself not to give attention. He exhaled slowly, the faint scent of rain and asphalt mixing with the subtle notes of cedar from his cologne. His driver waited silently by the black Bentley, a few steps behind, knowing better than to interrupt, knowing that when Ethan Kong paused it was never without reason. But still Ethan didn't move, not yet. He looked at the girl again, really looked this time, past the soaked clothes and trembling posture to the way her eyes held something steady beneath the fear, not desperation, not manipulation, but certainty, like she wasn't asking for help, she was delivering a truth he hadn't agreed to hear. And for the first time that night something inside him shifted, not enough to change his mind, not enough to break his control, but just enough to make him wonder what kind of situation could push a child to run toward a stranger dressed like power and expect to be heard. And that was the moment everything began to change, not with a decision, not with an action, but with a question he hadn't planned to ask himself. What if she wasn't lying? The silence did not break all at once. It stretched thin across the room like glass under pressure. Every second that Ethan Kong chose not to speak made the weight of his presence heavier, not lighter. And Daniel Brooks felt it first, not as fear, but as a subtle shift in control, the kind that experienced men recognize before anyone else. As he straightened slightly, adjusting his posture, as if reclaiming authority that had not yet been openly challenged. Mr. Kong, he said carefully, the name now spoken with the respect that had been missing before. We were just handling a situation that does not require your attention. The phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to contain the moment, to define it before it could be redefined by someone with greater power. But Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze moved past Daniel, not dismissing him, but placing him exactly where he belonged in the hierarchy, a detail, not the center. And instead he looked at Renee properly, this time not as part of a scene, but as a person, her coat still damp from the rain, her hands steady despite everything that had been said to her. And something about that steadiness unsettled him more than anger would have. She did not look like someone performing. She did not look like someone asking for sympathy. She looked like someone who had already accepted an outcome and was simply moving through it with dignity. And that did not align with the version of events he had constructed in his mind moments earlier. Still, his instincts held him in place, years of discipline reminding him that emotional reactions often led to unnecessary consequences, that power required distance, required control, required the ability to observe without being pulled into every situation that presented itself. And yet the child's question lingered. You said you own this place, right? He could feel it now, not as a demand but as a mirror held up to him, forcing him to confront something he had not intended to examine. What did ownership actually mean if it did not include responsibility for what happened under his name? Daniel misread the pause as agreement, or at least as permission to continue, and that miscalculation would become the first visible crack in the balance of the room. He gestured subtly toward the entrance. We will escort them out now, he said, his tone regaining confidence, as if The structure he relied on had returned to support him. There is no need to prolong this, and for a moment it seemed like the situation would resolve exactly as it always had, quietly, efficiently, without disruption. Renee nodded, once more beginning to guide Amara toward the door. Again her movements calm, measured, almost gentle, as if she were protecting not just her daughter but the space itself from further discomfort. And that was when Ethan noticed something he had not seen before, not in the room, not in the people, but in himself, a hesitation that did not come from strategy, but from uncertainty, not about what to do, but about why he had not already done it. His eyes followed the small details, the way Renee kept her shoulders relaxed despite the tension, the way Amara looked back at him, not with expectation anymore, but with something closer to disappointment. And that shift changed everything, because disappointment assumed that something better had been possible, and that was not a standard. Ethan Kong allowed himself to fail without consequence. The room waited, the staff no longer pretending not to watch, the guests no longer pretending not to listen. Even the subtle background music seemed to fade into something distant, irrelevant compared to the decision that had yet to be made. And in that suspended moment, Ethan finally moved, not forward, not dramatically, just one step, enough to signal that observation had ended and judgment was about to begin. And when he spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not need to be, because authority, when it is real, does not announce itself, it simply exists. What exactly, he said, looking directly at Daniel without haste, is the policy you are enforcing right now? The question was simple, but its implications were not. It did not accuse, it did not defend, it required an answer. And in that requirement, Daniel realized that the situation he thought he controlled had already moved beyond him into something far more dangerous than confrontation. It had become a test not of procedure but of principle, and the outcome of that test would not be decided by him. Daniel Brooks did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was enough to confirm what everyone in the room had already begun to suspect. There was no written policy that justified what had just happened, only interpretation shaped by assumption and comfort. He cleared his throat lightly, as if buying himself a few seconds of control, and then spoke with the same measured tone he had used before, but now there was a carefulness beneath it. We maintain a standard, Mr. Kong. Our guests expect a certain environment, and it is my responsibility to ensure that environment is preserved. Ethan tilted his head slightly, not in confusion but in examination, as if he were listening for something beyond the words themselves, and when he responded his voice remained calm, almost conversational. Define standard. The question landed with precision, not aggressive, not defensive, simply exact. And Daniel felt the shift immediately, because this was no longer a conversation he could guide, it was one he had to survive. Standard, he repeated briefly before continuing, choosing each word more carefully than before. Our clientele values discretion, presentation, consistency. We cannot risk situations that may disrupt that expectation. Ethan nodded once, slowly acknowledging the structure of the answer without accepting its substance, and his eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the guests, the phones that were no longer subtly raised but openly recording, the staff who stood straighter than before, their attention fixed on him. The environment you are protecting, he said quietly, is already disrupted. The words did not accuse, they stated a fact, and in doing so removed the illusion Daniel had been trying to maintain. For a moment no one spoke, the weight of that observation settling into the room with more impact than any raised voice could have achieved. Renee remained still near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Amara's shoulder, as if anchoring her in place, her expression unchanged, not hopeful, not defeated, simply present, as if she had learned long ago that outcomes often arrived without warning and preparation was a luxury she could not afford. Ethan looked at her again, and this time something unfamiliar surfaced, not recognition, not yet, but discomfort, a subtle awareness that his earlier judgment might not hold under closer scrutiny. And still he resisted it, because to reconsider meant to admit that his instincts, the ones that had kept him in control for years, might have failed him, and that was not a conclusion he reached easily. Daniel, sensing an opportunity, attempted to regain ground. If you prefer, I can arrange a private area for them elsewhere, he offered, quickly repositioning the situation as one of accommodation rather than exclusion. But the suggestion only deepened the silence, because it revealed the underlying assumption that they did not belong in the same space as everyone else. Ethan's gaze returned to him, and for the first time there was something sharper in it, not anger but clarity. No, he said simply, the word cutting through the room with more force than volume. What I prefer is understanding. He let the statement settle before continuing without raising his voice. Why did you decide she does not belong here? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no answer came immediately, because the truth, if spoken plainly, would expose more than policy. It would expose bias, and bias had no place in a system that claimed to operate on standards alone. Across the room a glass was set down more carefully than necessary. A chair shifted slightly, the smallest sounds amplified by the tension that now filled every corner. Ethan took another step forward, closing the distance, not aggressively but definitively, positioning himself between the defined boundaries that had been drawn without his consent. And in that moment, His presence was no longer passive observation, it was intervention, and yet even then he had not chosen a side, not fully, because something still held him back, a final piece of doubt, a lingering question about whether he was seeing the full picture or only the part that had been placed in front of him, and that doubt would soon be tested in a way he had not anticipated. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, because it was not designed to be answered quickly, it was designed to reveal something, and Daniel Brooks understood that now, his confidence no longer steady but carefully reconstructed piece by piece, as he searched for a response that would satisfy authority. Without exposing vulnerability, it is about consistency, he said finally, his voice controlled but quieter than before. We cannot allow situations that make our guests uncomfortable. The word uncomfortable settled into the room with a weight that no longer felt neutral. It sounded selective, measured against appearance rather than behavior, and Ethan Kong noticed that immediately, not with anger but with a growing precision in his thoughts, the kind that came when something did not align with the system. He had built. His gaze shifted again, not to Daniel, but to the guests seated nearby, watching, recording, listening, their expressions not disturbed, not uneasy, but curious, engaged, even entertained by the unfolding tension, and that observation quietly dismantled the justification that had just been offered. No one here looks uncomfortable, Ethan said calmly, his tone unchanged, and yet the impact of the statement moved through the room like a subtle correction, a recalibration of what was being claimed versus what was visible. Daniel followed his gaze instinctively, and for the first time saw what Ethan had already seen. The guests were not reacting with discomfort, they were reacting with attention, and attention was not what his reasoning had accounted for. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he quickly masked it again. The situation itself, he replied, attempting to redirect, is not aligned with the experience we provide here and there. It was not about behavior, not about disruption, but about perception, and that difference was impossible to ignore now. Ethan took another step, not forward this time, but slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both Renee and the room simultaneously, as if he were weighing two versions of reality against each other, and finding one lacking. Renee had not spoken again. She did not defend herself. She did not challenge the statements being made about her. She simply stood with a quiet composure that made the entire exchange feel unbalanced, as if one side was speaking too much while the other had already said everything necessary through silence. Amara, however, watched everything closely, her eyes moving between Ethan and Daniel, not with confusion but with a kind of careful observation that suggested she was trying to understand which adult in the room would choose to be honest, and that awareness pressed against Ethan more than any argument could have, because it was not demanding, it was expecting something. That expectation created a pressure he had not anticipated, not from the situation but from the realization that his response would not only define the outcome, it would define him in a way that could not be undone. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the soft ambient music that had resumed without anyone noticing, and then he spoke again, this time directing his question not to Daniel but to Renee. Do you feel uncomfortable? Here the shift in direction altered everything. The room's focus moved with it, the question itself simple, but its placement deliberate. It bypassed policy, bypassed interpretation, and went directly to the person who had been spoken about but not spoken to. Renee looked at him for the first time, fully meeting his gaze, and there was no hesitation in her response, not because she was unafraid but because she had already decided long before this moment how she would carry herself in places that did not welcome her. I feel, she said softly, choosing her words with care that carried more weight than volume. I feel like I am not wanted here. The honesty in her voice did not accuse, it did not demand, it simply existed, and in doing so it removed every layer of justification that had been built around her presence. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and something in his expression shifted again, not visibly to most but enough for those paying attention to recognize that the distance he had maintained since entering the room was beginning to narrow, not gone, not yet, but no longer absolute, and that change, though subtle, marked the beginning of something irreversible, because once a man like Ethan Kong allowed reality to replace assumption, there was no returning to the version of events that had once seemed convenient. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled deeper than anything that had been said before. I feel like I am not wanted here, and for a brief moment no one moved, not Daniel, not the guests, not even the staff who had been trained to maintain composure under any circumstance, because this was no longer about policy or perception, it was about truth spoken without defense, without performance, and that kind of truth had a way of dismantling carefully constructed systems. Ethan Kong stood still, his posture unchanged, yet something inside him had begun to shift in a way that could not be reversed, not because of the situation alone, but because of what her words revealed about his role in it. He had built this place, he had defined its standards, he had trusted others to carry those standards forward without question, and now he was faced with the possibility that what had been carried forward was not what he had intended but what had been assumed, and that distinction mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to consider. Daniel felt the shift as well, not in the words but in the silence that followed them, a silence that no longer protected him but exposed him, and for the first time since the exchange began he did not try to speak immediately because there was nothing left to justify without sounding smaller than he already felt. The authority he had relied on now seemed conditional, dependent on a man who had not yet fully declared his position, and that uncertainty made every second stretch longer than the last. Amara watched Ethan closely, her small hand still holding onto her mother's sleeve, but her attention fixed on him not with fear anymore but with something closer to quiet insistence, as if she understood that the moment had reached a point where something had to be decided, and that decision would not come from the person who had spoken the most, but from the one who had said the least. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not to avoid but to think, the polished floor reflecting faint outlines of the room around him, and in that reflection he saw more than just the present moment. He saw the structure he had created, the expectations he had reinforced, the distance he had maintained between himself and the realities that unfolded under his name, and for the first time that distance felt less like strength and more like absence. He lifted his head. Again, his eyes returning to Renee, not searching for confirmation but acknowledging what had already been made clear, and when he spoke his voice carried the same calm control it always had, but now there was something else beneath it, something that had not been there before, not softness, not sympathy but awareness. Then we correct that he said simply the statement, not dramatic, not loud but final, in a way that shifted the entire room. Daniel blinked slightly, as if he had not fully processed the meaning at first. "What do you mean, sir?" he asked, his voice lower, now less certain. Ethan did not look at him immediately. Instead he turned slightly toward the dining area, his gaze moving across the guests, the staff, the space itself, as if re-evaluating everything in a single glance. "This restaurant," he said slowly, "was not built to exclude, it was built to represent something better." The words were measured, each one placed with intention, and as they settled into the room they began to redefine it, not through force but through clarity. Daniel's posture stiffened, unsure whether he was being corrected or replaced in that moment, and before he could attempt another explanation, Ethan continued, "This is not about who can afford to be here," he said. "It is about who we choose to be when someone walks through that door." The distinction was subtle but absolute, and for the first time since the night began the balance of power was no longer uncertain. It had shifted completely, not because Ethan had raised his voice but because he had finally chosen to use it, and in doing so he had removed the space where misunderstanding could exist and replaced it with something far more difficult to ignore: responsibility. Responsibility did not arrive with noise, it settled into the room quietly but completely, reshaping the space between every person present. Daniel Brooks felt it first not as a command but as a loss, the kind that does not announce itself yet leaves nothing untouched. His authority, which had once filled the room with certainty, now felt conditional, fragile, dependent on a standard that had just been redefined. Without his consent he opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came because anything he said now would not defend his decision, it would expose it. Ethan Kong did not look at him immediately. Instead he turned fully toward Renee and Amara, closing the remaining distance, not in a way that suggested urgency but in a way that signaled intention, as if every step now carried meaning. He had not allowed before. The polished floor beneath him reflected the subtle shift in posture, the slight lowering of his shoulders, the absence of the rigid distance he had maintained since entering, and when he stopped a few feet in front of them, the difference in presence was unmistakable. He was still the most powerful man in the room, but he was no longer standing apart from it. Renee met his gaze again, her expression unchanged but her eyes more attentive now, as if she recognized that something real was finally being said without needing to be spoken. First Amara watched closely, her earlier urgency replaced by a quiet focus that suggested she was measuring not just what he would do but who he would be in this moment. Ethan spoke slowly, not because he needed time but because he understood that clarity required precision. "You asked me if I own this place," he said, looking at Amara directly, and for the first time his voice carried something that was not distance but presence. "I do." He let the statement settle, not as a declaration of power but as a foundation for what came next. "And that means what happens here is my responsibility, not someone else's interpretation of it." The words shifted the weight of everything that had happened, placing it squarely where it belonged, not on policy, not on staff but on him, and that acknowledgement changed the nature of the situation entirely, because ownership without accountability is authority without meaning. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission but in realization. The structure he had relied on had just been dismantled from the top, not with anger, not with punishment but with clarity, and that clarity left no space for defense. The guests who had been watching now sat differently, their attention no longer casual but fixed, the subtle movement of phones being lowered as if the moment had moved beyond something to capture and into something to witness. Ethan turned his head slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. "If anyone here believes that respect is determined by appearance or assumption," He said evenly. Then this is not the experience we provide. The statement was not directed at a single person, it was directed at the idea that had allowed the moment to exist at all, and in doing so it expanded the scope of responsibility beyond the individuals involved to the culture itself. Renee's fingers loosened slightly around her wallet, not because she felt relief, but because the tension she had carried was no longer being ignored. Amara stepped half a step closer to her mother, her small hand finding Renee's again, but her eyes never leaving Ethan. As if she needed to see the outcome fully before allowing herself to believe it, and Ethan noticed that, not consciously, not as a detail to analyze, but as something that reinforced the weight of what he was doing. This was not a correction for a single moment, it was a decision that would define every moment after he paused briefly, not for effect, but because there was one final piece of doubt that needed to be resolved within himself, not about what was right, but about why he had not seen it sooner. And as that realization settled, the last trace of hesitation disappeared. He turned back toward Daniel, his expression composed but no longer distant, and when he spoke again there was no ambiguity left in his tone. "We are not asking her to leave," he said quietly. "We are asking you to explain why you thought she should." The room held its breath, not because it expected an answer, but because it understood what the question demanded. Daniel Brooks stood where he was, his posture still upright but no longer anchored in certainty. The distance between him and Ethan Kong had not changed physically, but it had shifted in every other way. The authority he once carried now felt like something borrowed, something that could be taken back at any moment. He glanced briefly at the guests, as if searching for silent support, but found none, only eyes watching, waiting, measuring, and for the first time since the exchange began he realized that the room was no longer on his side. It was not against him either, it was simply observing, and that was far worse, because observation without allegiance left him alone with his own reasoning, and that reasoning now felt exposed. "I made a judgment," he said finally, his voice controlled but quieter than before. "Based on the standards we maintain here." The words sounded structured, but they lacked weight now because the foundation beneath them had already been questioned. Ethan did not interrupt, he allowed the statement to exist fully before responding, as if giving Daniel every opportunity to hear himself clearly, and then he asked another question, not louder, not sharper, but more precise. "What standard requires you to decide who belongs before they even sit down?" The shift was subtle but undeniable. This was no longer about policy, it was about assumption, and assumption once named could not hide behind procedure. Daniel hesitated again, and this time the pause stretched longer because there was no prepared answer for a question that dismantled the premise itself. "It is about presentation," he said after a moment, choosing the safest word available. "Our guests expect a certain level of consistency." Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the repetition without accepting its meaning, and his gaze moved once more across the room, taking in the carefully dressed diners, the polished glassware, the quiet elegance that defined the space. And then he spoke again. "Consistency does not mean exclusion," he said calmly, "it means integrity." The distinction was immediate and absolute. It did not attack Daniel directly, but it removed the justification he had relied on, leaving only the decision itself standing without support. A faint shift moved through the room, not in sound but in attention, the kind that signals understanding spreading without being spoken. Renee remained still, her presence unchanged, but now it carried a different weight, not because she had asserted anything new, but because what had been said about her no longer held authority. Amara squeezed her mother's hand slightly, her eyes still fixed on Ethan, as if she could feel the direction of the moment changing, even if she did not fully understand how. Daniel's composure began to fracture, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small details, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands remained too still, as if any movement might reveal more than he intended. "I did what I believed was appropriate," he said, his voice now less certain than before, and that admission, though subtle, marked the first true shift from defense to explanation. Ethan stepped closer, not aggressively, but with intention, closing the space that had once allowed distance to protect misjudgment. "Belief," he said quietly, "does not make something right. It only explains why it happened." The words did not condemn, they clarified, and in that clarity Daniel felt the final layer of his reasoning fall away, leaving only the reality of what he had done standing. Without structure, without language to soften it, the room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer uncertain, it was resolved. The question had been asked, the answer had been revealed, not through justification but through its absence, and in that absence the truth had become unavoidable, not because Ethan had forced it, but because he had allowed it to surface on its own. And now there was nothing left to interpret, only something left to decide.